Good afternoon. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lauren Palmore. I'm the Assistant Curator of American Art here at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and I was the coordinating curator for the DeYoung presentation of Alice Neel, People Come First. Today it is my pleasure to welcome you to Free Saturdays at the DeYoung Museum, and today's program is part of a programming series that celebrates Alice Neel's life and legacy through various in-person and digital features throughout the duration of the exhibition. Today's talk will illuminate and celebrate the life of Dewald Strauss, portrayed by Alice Neel in her painting Fuller Brushman. In this presentation, Jerry Strauss will share the true story of how his father, a Holocaust survivor, Allied soldier, Purple Heart recipient, and door-to-door salesman, crossed paths with the great American artist. Jerry Strauss has always loved music, art, and a good story. As a longtime employee of the Met, he had the chance to experience art on a daily basis. One day, during a TED event at the museum, he got an opportunity to tell the story of his dad, the subject of Neal's remarkable portrait, simply titled Fuller Brushman. That story evolved into his book, Giving My Father Back His Name, which teaches us that there is a profound tale behind every picture. This program will be immediately followed by a book signing. If you haven't done so already, please purchase your copy of the book at our museum store after the presentation. Thank you all, and thank you for joining me to help welcome Jerry Strauss.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thanks. So welcome. Thank you so much to all of you for coming here today, both in person and virtually. And I wanted to send a quick thanks and a shout out to Tom Campbell, the great director of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Of course, Lauren, who has just been amazing in terms of how she put this show together here. And of course, Maria Egavil, the public programs project manager here in the education department. And thanks to all of you again for coming today. So it all started back in 1984. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I got a phone call from my cousin Linda. She said to me, "Are you sitting down? Your father is in the New York Times." And he had passed away 10 years earlier in 1974. And I just couldn't figure it out. Like, what is this all about? So I ran to the newspaper stand and got the paper, and there was an article about Alice Neel. It was a review of a gallery show at the Robert Miller Galleries in New York City. And of all the paintings in that gallery show, the featured one was Fuller Brushman. I had never seen the painting. I didn't know it existed. Dad passed away when I was only 19. It wasn't like a big to-do. When he met her, she was unknown in 65. So I thought about it and I said, how did this come about? And I realized, of course, Dad, in fact, was a Fuller Brushman. And Alice lived near him. So Dad sold Fuller brushes of every type imaginable, various household products. And Alice lived at 300 West 107th Street, right across the street from this painting, and right around the corner from my dad's stockroom. So obviously, they met because she was one of his customers. And it all started coming together for me. So in high school, I would actually help Dad with his deliveries to his customers after I'd finished school. And I probably met Alice on one of those delivery dates. Can't be sure. I was like 16, 17. She was just another customer at that time. But I loved those Friday nights, helping Dad. Had some tip money in hand after a long day of delivering, and really looking forward to my mom's German Jewish meals after we took the number 4 bus uptown. I was excited about this. I wrote this note to my brother, who lives in DC, telling him that I would be going to this gallery to see this painting of our dad. And there it was. We entered the Robert Miller Gallery, my wife and I, and we saw this incredible portrait of my father, him looking back at me with that wonderful smile, that glint in his eyes. I hadn't seen him in 10 years. It was an amazing experience for me. So the painting was on sale for $35,000, and that was a lot of money for me at the time, so my brother and I couldn't buy the painting. My cousin Norm came as well, of course, thought about buying the painting as well. So my brother and I didn't have that $35,000 to purchase it, but of course we could purchase a book of Alice Neel's works. And in it, Dad's painting is prominently there, Fuller Brushman, but an anonymous Fuller Brushman who had escaped from Nazi Germany. So what's the backstory behind Dad and Alice Neel? Why did she paint him? What did they have in common? Well, Alice had a pretty rough life. She was poor, she was a single mother, she lived among other folks of a similar background in Spanish Harlem on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but she had an amazing passion for her artwork and for painting in her own unique style. Dad grew up in Germany, and at 13, in post-World War I Germany, he needed to leave home and become an apprentice because the economic situation was horrific at that time in Europe, especially in Germany. There was hyperinflation. Money was literally used for games by children. It was worth nothing. But by the late 20s, Dad started to prosper. He was free to practice his religion in Germany. He got a good job as a traveling textile salesman. He had a pretty good life. He was able to carry out his work with the help of a chauffeur who helped him lug his samples and his orders to his various customers throughout Germany. He was able to visit Baden-Baden, the famous German resort, without any problems. Here is a picture with his sister, my aunt, also named Alice. But by 1933, Hitler came to power, and the Nazi Party came into power, and there was tremendous anti-Semitism in the country. And of course, Alice Neel, being very politically conscious, knew about this and painted Nazis murdered Jews in 1936. In early November of 1938, the Nazis carried out Kristallnacht, the pogrom of the German Jews. And hundreds of synagogues were desecrated and destroyed, as were thousands of German Jewish businesses. And that same night, November 11th, 1938, there was a knock on the door, and Dad was deported to Dachau. And there he just became a number. This is an original ledger from the Dachau concentration camp. And he just became number 20,139, one of 18,000 prisoners that were inducted in 1938 alone. And there were others in that roundup. There was my grandfather, Leopold, and he was also inducted at exactly the same time. And then there was my Uncle David. And what I realized as I was studying this original ledger, I realized, wow, Dad and Uncle David were inducted almost simultaneously. So I learned that at least Dad was in this hellish concentration camp, but at least he wasn't alone. But it was an incredibly dangerous place. Any minor infraction would lead to horrific punishment and even death. The conditions were horrific. When he finally escaped, he did tell me that he needed to destroy all of the clothes he had because they were so full of lice. Dachau is an interesting place. The gates to the concentration camp have a very simple message. Arbeit macht frei. Work frees you. But once you're on the other side of that gate, everything changes. You become a number. You're forced to strip. shave off all your hair. You're given this number, you're given a label, a Jew, a Catholic, a homosexual, a political prisoner, a gypsy, with one of these labels. And you're given one of those flimsy uniforms, of course, with a number. The daily routine started with the roll call and ended with the roll call. The SS wanted to make sure that the ledger matched that head count, counting every single prisoner. And again, there were 18,000 that entered Dachau in 1938 alone. What's really amazing about this painting by a former inmate, David Ludwig Bloch, is this is precisely when my dad was in Dachau. So he's literally one of these specks in this huge count for the daily roll call. And they did this in the freezing cold of winter, in the early morning, and in the blazing heat of summer. By the way, Mr. Bloch added his number, if you can see there, emphasizing that that's what you became when you entered Dachau. So after roll call, you had daily duties of work. One of the former inmates noted road roller duty, where, like pack animals, 50 men pulled the heavy road roller up and down the road, a sight that recalled ancient Egyptian slavery. And then, of course, there was just normal corporeal punishment that went on all day, all week. Here's an original whipping, trestle, and bullwhip from Dachau. But Dad was sort of one of the lucky ones. So at the end of 1938, the Nazi Party, their main goal at that time was to rid Germany of as many Jews as possible. But there were two conditions. One was you were willing to give up every one of your possessions. But the bigger ask was you needed a place to go. And that wasn't easy, because everybody was trying to escape. My grandmother, Strauss, actually went to the Gestapo in Regensburg and pleaded to them to let her son go. She was a widow at the time. Her other children were already in the States, so she was dependent on my dad. I think they thought she was pretty feisty and were impressed, but in the end, actually, there was a refugee agency in Berlin that helped him make it to the UK. And he landed in a refugee camp in the summer of '39. It was called Kitchener Camp in the south of England. But his real goal was, complete freedom. He was just a temporary refugee in England. He wanted to come to the States. And he wanted to join his siblings, my Aunt Alice, and of course bring his mother out to freedom. So Alice wrote this affidavit to the US government saying, hey, I will take care of Dewald with my $50 a month salary working as a governess for this wealthy New York family. And it worked. Dad was able to come over on this ship, the SS Lancastria, in late '39. He really skirted death in this situation. The war had already started, obviously, in September '39, and this ship was torpedoed by the Nazis not more than 6 months later. 5,000 casualties. So this certificate of arrival, it simply says, hey, Dewald Strauss arrived on December 27th. But to me, it's symbolic of his arrival in a new country with new opportunities, freedom, and safety. He ended up at a job at the New York World's Fair as a busboy. So far cry from his more lucrative job in Germany, but he was safe and free and able to practice his religion. My mom was at the same fair. This is her with my Uncle Carl, her brother. Dad and Mom didn't cross paths at the fair and met years later after the war in New York. And life comes full circle. My two sons, they both had their bar mitzvah receptions at this venue, just a couple of 100 yards from that earlier picture. So after Pearl Harbor, Dad entered the Army, and the very interesting thing to me is it was November 11th, 1942. So it was 4 years to the day that he had been inducted into Dachau during Kristallnacht. So he goes from being a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp to a uniformed serviceman in the US Army fighting the Nazis that had oppressed him. Very quickly, he got involved in major conflicts. He was shipped out to France in 1944 after initially arriving in the UK. And he arrived in France just in time for the Battle of the Bulge. This was the greatest military operation of World War II. And of course, the whole idea was that the Allies would push east into Germany and overthrow the Nazi regime. But the timing was extremely difficult. The battle started just around Christmas Day of 1944. And what I found interesting was my brother found this old field jacket of my dad's, and it was all about protecting our troops. So this was an advanced windproof design to help you in the bitter cold of the Battle of the Bulge. Whereas again, years earlier, the Nazis just gave him this flimsy prison uniform, and their intent was to freeze their prisoners. Dad performed some heroics very early in the battle. He was awarded the very prestigious Bronze Star Medal, and it was for meritorious achievement in ground operations on or about January 4th, 1945. So within 2 weeks of the battle, he's becoming, a very important part of that operation. So the Allies pressed east, and by March, they had actually breached the Nazi defensive lines and made it into Germany. And there's a small town called Andernach, which you can see all the way up there on the left. And there was a firefight there. There was intense shelling, and Dad received multiple shrapnel wounds. What's really crazy about this is this battle occurred 250 kilometers from where he grew up. So think about that. You're fighting for your life in this war against the government you grew up with, and it's like literally almost in your backyard. So he did recover. He underwent several operations, was sent right back to the front to push on to Berlin, and received a Purple Heart for his service to the country. One thing Dad told me about the war was being captured was not a good option for him. He was actually very worried about this. Being a German Jew who immigrates to the States, comes back in an American uniform and is fighting his oppressors. And, fortunately that didn't happen. He was discharged honorably in January of 46. And what did he know how to do? He knew how to sell. So he became a Fuller brush dealer, America's most famous visitor. So they were pretty popular back in the 40s. And he sold brushes and other household products of every type imaginable. One of the more famous products, I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, but I used to love this, was the crumb sweeper. So this was used to tidy your tabletop so that it would be crumb-free. And I remember it was actually a very practical thing to have. So Dad's job was to knock on doors on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, going door to door. And, some days were pretty tough. He didn't have a lot of order forms filled out for the Fuller Brush Company. And there was more potatoes than meat on the table, but other times were, more prosperous. But by the 60s, New York was becoming a pretty tough place, a lot of crime. Things were sort of breaking down, and he was actually mugged and landed in the hospital with a concussion when I was a teenager. He recuperated, and he went back to work. But I think it sort of signifies Dad and what Alice Neel was interested in her portraits. She once said, I love to paint people. I'm sorry. She once said that Cézanne said, I love to paint people who have grown old naturally in the country. Whereas her attitude was, I love to paint people torn to shreds by the rat race in New York. And yeah, I don't think Dad was torn to shreds, but certainly, he was living that kind of tough life in New York, especially in the 60s. So Dad recuperated, really liked his customers, went back to work, and in 1965, in this building, 300 West 107th Street, he met Alice Neel, and she said, please sit for me, I would like to paint you. And that's when Fuller Brush Man was created. Years passed, and in 1974, Alice actually became quite well known. She had her first major show at the Whitney at the age of 74. I think everybody knows she was born at the turn of the last century, 1900. And she was even inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a very prestigious institution. Unfortunately, Dad died that year in 74, so he never knew of her growing fame. And then I got busy, I got married, I had a couple of kids, so after we discovered the painting in 1984, things got a lot quieter for me with respect to Fuller Brush Man. But in 2000, I got another one of those phone calls. Hey, Jerry, your dad's painting is back. Alice was having a major show at the Whitney again, this time to celebrate her centennial. And of course, this is her famous self-portrait that was on the cover of the brochure. So what I didn't realize about this show is that Fuller Brush Man was actually a big part of the marketing campaign. There is Dad in the New York Times again, this time with all of these other famous portraits that Alice Neel had done. And he's in Time Out New York with Andy Warhol, like he's all over the place. But what really blew me away was the mass transit advertising. So imagine I'm walking down Madison Avenue in New York City, and these big buses are coming by with these gigantic posters, including my dad. So I almost felt like, he was saying hello as I walked down the street. Same thing with the subways. There were big posters as you entered the subway at various stations throughout the city. My brother visited that summer and wanted one of these posters and was thinking about swiping the posters. So cooler heads prevailed, and we said, let's find the company that made these posters. I was working for Chanel at the time, and we quickly exchanged a couple of bottles of Chanel No. 5 for a couple of posters, and so nobody ended up in trouble. So people have often asked me what I think of the painting. I think it's great, but I'll get into that later. The person that really loved the painting was my Aunt Alice. She had never seen it. And in fact, she was interviewed by the local German Jewish paper, and of course the title was My Brother, the Fuller Brush Man. She was just enamored of Dad and this painting, he was her older brother. And when we went to the Whitney show, anybody that would listen, she would say, that's my brother. She was like so proud of that. And I think the visitors got a kick out of it too. My cousin Norm visited again years later, and he always made this very interesting comment that, most of us will live our lives and sort of move on, and, a lot of us are going to be forgotten. And he'd always say, you know what, your dad has been immortalized by this incredible painting. He'll live on in spirit forever. So I always appreciated that comment. The other thing about the show, and you've probably seen it in this show, and I know Lauren knows this, is so many of his subjects are, sort of a little bit on the down and depressed and the somber side. And, then you've got Dad with this optimistic demeanor, go for it, you have to live life to the fullest. he loved the family. He was sort of this real optimist, and he's got that smile, which is unusual for her portraits. Yeah, so getting back to what I think about the painting, I think a lot of it is very realistic. He wore that blue suit. In the 60s, people wore bow ties like that. Things are a little exaggerated, his hands, but I think it sort of symbolizes his optimism. Those things in his pocket are a couple of brush samples, of course, it's gotta be brushes. And those two little tubes underneath are for his cigars. He was still a big fan of the cigar, growing up in Germany. And if you look at his right hand on his pinky, there's this little pinky ring, and I actually have that. It's one of the few possessions of his I have. It simply says DS on the inside in this sort of Germanic type of script. And then other folks have asked me, what do you think about the process that Alice Neel used in these portrait sittings? And I think Roberta Smith described it really well in the review of the show back in 2000. And I'll quote her. She says, "You can almost hear Neal talking at the Whitney, talking to her friends, her lovers, children, and grandchildren as she painted them, talking strangers into sitting for her, like the lean, nattily dressed Fuller Brush man, whom she painted in '65, learning in the process that he was a Holocaust survivor, and talking people who had already agreed to pose into doing so nude." And I have to admit, I'm very happy she didn't convince Dad to pose in the nude. We'll take the blue suit anytime. The other thing about Alice Neel that I think is really interesting, and Barry Walker, a curator from the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, made this point. Her works are largely uncommissioned. And, quoting Barry, he says, "Since her portrait work was largely uncommissioned and did not require that she flatter her sitter, you get a sense of how people really looked. And that's as true for the cheerful Fuller Brush man who showed up on her doorstep in '65, as it is for the art world elites who posed for her, including Andy Warhol." The other thing about that 2000 show is we realized, here we are, 35 years after the painting was done, and it's still completely anonymous. Like, no one knows that Fuller Brush Man is Dewald Strauss. Ann Temkin was the curator of the wonderful show in 2000. And so we wrote this letter to her, my family and I, and we just wanted her to know the basics, "Dear Ann, the name of the Fuller Brush Man is Dewald Strauss. This is when he was born. This is when he died. He had a family. By the way, he was a war hero, and of course, he was a Holocaust survivor." So that winter, one of the stops on that show was the wonderful Philadelphia Museum of Art. So my kids like trains, as do I, and the two of us hopped on Amtrak down to Philly. And we went to see Grandpa's painting in Rocky's museum. And when we walked into the show, there was this incredible label which actually included Dad's name. I wrote this description down on this brochure. I didn't have a camera at the time. And here's what it said. It said, "When Dewald Strauss," that was a big deal for me that his name was there, "a door-to-door salesman for Fuller Brushes, stopped at Neal's New York City apartment, she asked him to pose for a portrait. And during the course of the sitting, Neal found that Strauss was a concentration camp survivor who, after his escape, heroically enlisted in the US Army and returned to Europe to fight against the Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge." So that was a huge moment for us. The Fuller Brush Man finally had a name. My dad, Mr. Dewald Strauss. So you can see there have been so many coincidences in this story. Dad was a Fuller Brush man. His territory was where Alice Neel lived. She wanted to paint him. The art critic decided to use this painting in her article, and of course my cousin Linda called me at the time and said, "You have to check this out." But after the 2000 show, once again, things calmed down a little bit for me with respect to Fuller Brush Man. Went back to, being busy with things. But things popped up again with Alice Neel. It seems like she was always lingering in the background. And Andrew Neal did a wonderful documentary about his grandmother back in 2007. Of course, I didn't know if Fuller Brush Man would be in the documentary, so I ran off to the Village Film Forum to check it out. And it was pretty cool seeing Dad's painting on the big screen in a movie theater. That was really cool. And in a write-up of the show, Dad's mentioned again, and the critic notes, in Fuller Brush Man, a portrait of a salesman who survived Dachau, the man's eager face and posture suggest the hunger behind his American dream. I thought that was a very fitting description. So a few years later, I was having a wonderful New Year's Eve dinner with my wife, my friend Mark Lippitz, and my friend Lucia Yee Lippitz. And she is an enormous Alice Neel fan, a wonderful artist. And she turned to me and said, "Hey, Jerry, I think you're going to be about the age of your dad when Alice Neel painted him." I said, "Yeah, I think next year we're going to be about the same age." So she said, "Do me a favor. I'd like a picture of you. Sort of dress up a little bit like your dad. Sort of sit a little bit like your dad, wear that ring." And my son took this picture of me. And the next thing I knew, she produced Son of Fuller Brush Man. So we just had so much fun with this. This was just such a great project. And of course, I want to thank Lucy for doing that. Here's the juxtaposition, Dad and me and Dad. So it's really a lot of fun. And here, just very quickly, I have to give Lucy credit. It was her idea to create this graphic novel about Dad and Alice Neel and the fantastic Fuller Brush Man portrait. So I started working at the Met a couple of years after that in '09. And I'm an information technology guy, an IT guy. And I was in a place where I had a chance to really learn about art. And so pretty much every day after lunch on my way back to the office, I would take like 10 minutes and go to a great exhibition that these wonderful curators put on. And my love of art, increased as I worked there. And then in 2015, Tom Campbell, who is obviously the director here, he was the director at the Met. He announced that the Met would be expanding into a third venue. It was to be called Met Breuer for modern art, and it was in the old Whitney building, of all places, because they had moved downtown. So the Whitney was going to become this new branch of the museum, and to celebrate, it was going to be a TED event where various speakers would talk and to celebrate this new museum. There were luminaries that were invited. Isabella Rossellini was there, and other really interesting people. But Tom announced that one or two staff members who auditioned and passed the audition would be able to speak at this event. So, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm this IT guy. There are these incredible art experts at the Met, curators and historians and conservators. But I felt like I had a story to tell. Last time I saw my dad's painting was in that venue. I'm working for this museum that's opening that venue. I said, I have to give it a try. So the good news was I made it. I was accepted in the audition. Here's the press announcement right there. I was very happy that I had a chance to tell this story to a broader audience. It was really thrilling. And so I practiced a lot. The Met is basically in Central Park. On my way to work, I was talking to myself, practicing. And I was in the brochure right next to Isabella, so that was fun. I got a kick out of that. And I think the show went pretty well. And after the show, one of Tom's assistants for acquisitions actually said to me, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool if the Met could acquire the painting of your dad?" I was like, "Yeah, that would be amazing." But of course, that was just, talk, and that never came to pass. But it was a fun idea. So then a couple of years after that, actually in 2019, I met Randall Griffey, one of the modern art curators at the Met, and he mentions to me, we're doing this big Alice Neel show in a couple of years. And of course, I immediately said, "Is Fuller Brushman going to be in the show?" And he sort of coyly said, "Yeah, I'm working on that." It was very early in the process. But of course, the pandemic hit. And, New York was just shut down. And of course, including the Met and many other fine institutions. So, would this show go on? So, of course, at the end of 2020, I contacted Randy, and he said, "Yes, People Come First will be on for March 2021. I was very happy about that. After the Met show, it traveled to the Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain, and then, of course, came here in this wonderful venue. And it's funny about Dad, so he never flew. And now the painting of Dad is flying all over the world, and acquiring a lot of air miles. So I think that's pretty interesting. So the show opened in March of 2021 at the Met. And I just wanted to read you a couple of quotes from Roberta Smith, once again, who had a chance to do the critique 20 years later. So she says, "It's time to put Alice Neel in her rightful place in the pantheon. A large retrospective should silence any doubt about the artist's originality or her importance. The largest Neel retrospective yet seen in New York confirms Neel as destined for icon status, on the order of Van Gogh and Hockney. And there are several middle galleries dedicated to her portraits of the 60s and 70s, considered by many to be her best work. And of course, Fuller Brushman was created in 1965. So I was pretty proud of this thing. I was, sort of like my Aunt Alice. I'm a New Yorker. Probably went about a dozen times over the course of because all my friends and relatives wanted to go. So I wasn't working at the Met anymore at that time. So I didn't fulfill my dream of seeing the painting anytime, but as a visitor, of course, I had great opportunities to visit as long as I wanted. And then my big question was, do I pull an Aunt Alice? Do I go up to people and say, that's my dad? And some people might think it was cool. Some people might think I was crazy. So I really had to think about that one. So I noticed that there were mostly like single visitors who definitely appreciated the wonderful painting and the wonderful label, but sort of moved on, right? Because there's so many incredible works in this show. And of course, institutions like this and the Met, there's so much else to see, so I totally understood that. But then it seemed like groups of people would linger quite a bit and talk about the label and the incredible painting. And I also noticed that when I talked to them, they said the same thing, like, the painting of your dad is just, it's so optimistic and he's so upbeat, and there are the other well-known works that are, the subjects are much more somber and depressed. So I talked quite a bit to the folks that were in these groups. One of the groups I met were other family members whose mostly grandparents had this similar experience. They were refugees, came to the States, returned to fight the Nazis, and also earned Purple Hearts. So I felt really good. I almost felt like Dad was representing this group of, other unsung heroes. So one of the groups, there was Hans and Marion Ettlinger, who I talked to. Bob and Marion Ettlinger. And their dad, Hans, was also a refugee who returned to fight the Nazis. And he had a very interesting job. So he was in a POW processing group. And their job was obviously to manage all of the German prisoners of war in France and Germany in 44 and 45. So one of Hans's prisoners was a really good artist who had studied portraiture in Paris before the war. And this prisoner was dying for a pack of cigarettes. So Hans struck a deal with this prisoner. A pack of cigarettes for a wonderful portrait. So this is Hans Ettlinger, painted by a German POW towards the end of World War II in this processing center. And of course, Bob and Marion, to this day, cherish this painting. It was a great opportunity last year for friends and relatives to see this painting for the first time. This is my sister-in-law, Janet. She'd never met her father-in-law. And it was an emotional meeting. She shed a tear. Same with my niece, Katrina. She'd never met her grandfather. And there's something about seeing that portrait that's very moving for family members. My wife had a chance to take a selfie with her father-in-law, whom she also never met. And of course, we needed to have a grandson grandson picture, which honestly, we just did one now as well. And a great opportunity for friends to come from near and far. My friends Rob and Vicky came from Seattle to see the show. And then I had my New York buddies who actually knew my dad, because I have some childhood friends. My friends Royce and Fred and Mitch and many others. This is Mitch, and Mitch was really encouraging me to talk to people. And he started talking to many people saying, oh, I knew Dewald, he always wanted to keep us fed. And by the way, he had a very heavy German accent. So people love talking to my friends about Dad too. And of course, my brother came from Washington. And it was a chance for him to look through some old family archives. My mom had some folders that she had sort of squirreled away somewhere and never really shared with us. And she passed away when we were pretty young too. And he found this really interesting article from Newsweek in 1966. So it was less than a year after she had done Fuller Brushman. And Newsweek, probably many of you know, was like really a pretty big deal back in the 60s. But the very last paragraph, which you can see my mom bracketed, was specifically about Fuller Brushman. And here's what it says. So she pulls out Fuller Brushman, the painting, and says, there he is, door worn in his 2 blue suit. He fell asleep while I painted him, and he was a survivor of Dachau. He also found this 1983 book by Patricia Hills, in which she has many interviews documented with Alice. And in the book, Alice says to Patricia Hills, well, I spoke to the Fuller Brushman, and I told him I visited Dachau. And the monument there to the unknown prisoner has this person wearing this winter coat. And my dad turns to Alice and says, that is nonsense. We had those thin striped suits. That makes no sense. And then he had to leave and knock on more doors and make some sales. I also had a chance to be interviewed last year by Brandon Stanton, the author of Humans of New York. It's a book, New York Times bestselling book, and a wonderful blog with millions of followers. And it was another wonderful chance for me to tell my story to a broader audience about my dad and Alice and Fuller Brushman. And I had a chance to explain that, the most important thing to me was Dad was this really loving family man. Like, he loved my mom and my brother and I. And I also talked to Brandon about the fact that, I did have a little bit of a quest about getting Dad's name out there because there's a precedent. I mean, many of Alice Neel's wonderful portraits, have the name behind the sitter. And I thought, why not have Dad's name out there? And then finally, it's been a great opportunity for me to learn more about my folks, in preparing for things like this, and giving me the chance to share my learnings about my parents with my family who never had a chance to meet them. So the other thing I learned during the show is Alice didn't really like the term portrait. She always thought of portraits as, sort of stodgy men, in these boardrooms, and those are portraits. And she felt she was a painter of the people, a much broader array of subjects, and I think that's really true. So the new label from the People Come First show in New York and here is just wonderful. Kudos to the curators who put this together. Really makes my heart hum. And I just want to read this to you because I just think it's amazing. So the current label now says, Neal titled this portrait of Dewald Strauss in a knowing nod to the mid-century iconicity of his vocation as a door-to-door salesman of hairbrushes. Yet his portrayal far exceeds the cliche, as the brushes in his breast pocket appear incidental in the context of his singular life. Interned by the Nazis in Dachau, Strauss eventually escaped and emigrated to America, only to return to Germany as an Allied soldier, earning a Purple Heart for his service. Working in her Upper West Side studio home, Neal painted Strauss in a harmony of blues and grays, while sensitively following how the folds in his suit echo the creases of his skin. With his alert stance and open expression, Strauss meets Neal's gaze with clear-eyed sincerity, revealing an unabashed positivity in his eager pursuit of the American dream. Alice once said, "I have tried to assert the dignity and eternal importance of the human being." And indeed, I believe she has done so in painting Fuller Brush Man, my dad, Mr. Dewald Strauss. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. So I think we have an opportunity for some Q&A with the help of Maria and Rosario. So love to answer any questions if you have any.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why did you use the term inducted,
Uh-huh.
talking about prisoners going into that prison?
Right. I mean,
Jerry?
that's a great question. So the question was, why did I use the term inducted?
Jerry?
Oh, yeah, I think I did. The question was, why did I use the term inducted? I think you mean referring to Dachau. That's a terrific question. I mean, maybe I should have used the term abducted, because literally that's what happened. I guess I was referring to it because the Nazis were very procedural. And when you entered these camps, it wasn't this crazy, chaotic situation. You were brought into this. Now I realize why I use the term, because that processing room was called the induction room. You were induced into this camp. You lost your regular life and you just became a number. But now that I think of it, next time maybe I'll use the term abducted, because they literally were kidnapped from their homes and forcibly taken to the camps en masse that November. Thank you for that question.
I just wanted
I'm sorry.
to tell you I loved it. I share a similar past to you. My father's from Berlin too, but luckily my family got out in 1938 and went to China. So it's a wonderful story. My father's from Berlin too. And my father died only a couple years ago. I lived a long time, but all of the immigrants that came to this country, I found an article my dad wrote a little write-up about him at GE, but they were all proud of what they did, and they were so proud to be American. But you have a great story, but what I didn't quite get, so he got somebody to sponsor him? Is that how did he finally get out of Dachau?
Yeah,
I know he had somebody sign for him, you said, but it was so hard to get here, I know.
Oh, yeah. So I think what happened was, again, a lot of people don't understand this because, of course, we all know the horrific stories of Auschwitz and the 42, 43, 44 era where it was, almost exclusively the gas chamber crematorium kind of scenario. In Dachau in 38, it was relatively early in the operation to rid Germany and Europe of Jews. So there were many murders at the time within the camp, but they were more random. The Nazis had not really come up with the, quote, final solution of the crematoria. So at that time, the policy turned towards, let's just get rid of these people. And there was, with research, I found that there was a very well-organized German Jewish refugee organization in Berlin, and somehow that organization was able to sponsor him for initially leaving the camp and getting him, but they needed to get him out of the country. And fortunately, the Brits accepted him, again, just on a temporary basis. You know, he was considered an alien in England. A lot of people, unfortunately, just didn't want the Jews of Europe. But fortunately, my Aunt Alice was already in the States, and that sponsorship with that affidavit was able to get him to permanent safety in the States. He got here right on the edge of 39, 40. I mean, actually, I'm sure everybody remembers this from history, but the Nazis invaded Poland in September 39. So he was actually in transit during the war, and that ship he was on was actually destroyed shortly after he was on it, coming to the States when it went back to Europe. So he came over very late after the war had started already. I'm sorry, I think there was a question here. What did
your dad think of the painting?
Well, you know, honestly, he didn't talk much about it. You know, Alice was just not well known at the time. You know, he would often come home quite late from work because he needed to be out working in the early evenings when people were home. In those days, you know, particularly housewives were available if they were working during the day and they were home. So we didn't talk about it much, and I was very young when it was done in 65. And then unfortunately, just, you know, he passed away only 7 years later, and then my mom passed away a couple of years after, 9 years later. My mom passed away a couple of years after that. So there was just other stuff happening in my family. And as I mentioned, the year she became, you know, better known in the art world in 74 was the year Dad passed away. So I never really spoke to him about, hey, Dad, what do you think of your portrait? It just wasn't discussed. And that's why I didn't know anything about it. If he had discussed it, I wouldn't have been as surprised in 84. Yeah. But great question. Thank you.
Jerry, it's Bob Ettlinger.
Oh, hey, Bob. I'm so glad you made it. This is Bob. His dad, Hans, is who I just talked about. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure, and thank you for telling such an incredible story. I wanted to ask you, what would have happened had you and your brother had $35,000, and how would this story may have been different? Were you the owner of the painter rather than just an admirer of the painter?
That's a great point, and you know, I was gonna say this in the talk, so I'm actually prepared for your question. So, you know, and this really came out honestly when Brandon Stanton interviewed me. I give him credit; he's an amazing interviewer. If anybody of you ever has a chance to be in Humans of New York, go for it. I basically Brandon had the same question, and my response was, if we acquired it, we could have never, ever sold it because it would be like selling a member of my own family. So we just would have kept it. I'm not a fine arts collector, so honestly, I'm not sure how I would have managed it. But certainly, if we had acquired it at that time, you know, we would have just held on to it for dear life forever. But fortunately, there's the wonderful owners of the painting are very generous in lending it out to such fine institutions as this one. And so I've had several opportunities to see the real thing, and so I still feel like it's a huge part of my life. Any other questions? There's such great questions.
Another point. What I get when I see your father's face and his body and his hands is that when you know Neal and the strength of her personality and the two of them meet, you can feel that strength of both of them. And that is the grace and the present and the beauty of what we see in your father. And what she was able to pull and say, this is going to be seen. Everyone is going to see this.
I agree with you. I mean, I think she had this incredible power and skill at bringing out the true nature of her subjects. She was so skilled at that, at bringing out their real spirit. And I think you're right. I think there was something about the two of them. They both had their struggles. I think they mutually appreciated each other. And as you said, she was able to realize that in the incredible portrait of Dad in Fuller Brushman. But thank you so much for those comments. Any other questions? We have Rosario and Maria with the mics. Okay. All right. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. So